class. Today we are going to be taking a look at Fort Jean-Baptiste in Louisiana.
And this is where we meet our friend Louis Juchereau de Saint-Denis, who's going to play a big part not only in French in Louisiana, but also in Texas history. Here along the banks of the Camino River, Saint-Denis is going to come in 1714 as he is journeying to Texas to establish relations with the Spanish. And here he is going to establish an outpost to trade with the local Natchitoches, which are a group of the Caddo Indian. And this will eventually become the oldest settlement along the French part of El Camino Real. Initially, Saint-Denis had a couple of huts built near the Natchitoches Indians so that he could have a presence here to trade with them. 2 years later, the French will send another expedition to build an actual fort on this site. In 1716, the French sent Claude Tassoum to build a permanent fort here where Saint-Denis had established his trading post. This is a replica of Fort Jean-Baptiste, which will become the permanent base for the French for a number of years on the edge of French Louisiana next to Spanish Texas.
Now let's take a look inside Fort Jean-Baptiste. To the left is the guardhouse. In front of us there is a building in which the commander, eventually it would have been Saint-Denis, would have lived. He eventually built a church in which they could worship. On the other side of the compound there were quarters for the soldiers, as well as a couple of other buildings for businessmen who came to trade along El Camino Real.
Here inside one of the buildings here at Fort Saint-Jean-Baptiste, you can see that this was a very well constructed fort. The buildings are fairly comfortable for the soldiers and settlers. This was about as good as life got on the frontier. Here inside the guardhouse, come on in. I figured you students would be interested where you're going to be put if you misbehave at the fort. And this is one of the things that you might be familiar with. This is a stocks. It's got a place for both of your feet, and something like this could be used to constrain a prisoner, or as punishment you could sit them out in the sun, on the ground, in the stocks. You also might have the kind that you might have your head or your arms in, but that was a good way to confine, publicly humiliate someone who had committed a crime. And sitting out in the sun also, confined like this, would be a pretty stiff punishment for any soldier that had misbehaved. Inside the quarters for the enlisted men, the men would have had a long bed, basically, that they all would have slept side by side on. It's slightly sloped, kind of, so you'd be sleeping on kind of a raised surface, because most people at that time slept somewhat sitting up rather than laying flat on their backs. As you can see, for a number of soldiers this might be somewhat crowded, but also fairly decent quarters to help try to stay warm in the winter and give them a good roof over their heads. This particular fellow seems to have plenty to eat today, so looks like trade is going well for them. One of the primary purposes of this outpost was trade goods. The French had established this post for trade, both with the local natives and to trade with the Spanish across the border in Texas. And so there was a large supply of trade goods. Many French businessmen, traders would come into this area to trade with the Indians, to trade with the Spanish. and they could make a pretty good living exchanging goods between these cultures. In fact, this particular outpost was a very multicultural outpost with Spaniards, Frenchmen, native tribes coming here to trade, and for the most part, this was a fairly peaceful settlement with good relations between these groups of people. Another important part of this outpost eventually was the church. Saint-Denis himself initially established a place for worship in his own residence, and eventually a small church was built in the fort itself. And this would have been an important place where the French could have worshipped. All right, so with any fort, one of the most important things, you notice at the corners there's a little bit of an outcrop. This is an important part of a fort. If you have enemies attacking and they get right up against the wall, you would have to lean over to shoot them, unless you have this. That allows anybody that gets along the side of the wall, you can shoot down the length of any one of these walls. When we later on study the Battle of the Alamo, we're going to see the Alamo did not have this, and that was one of the major failings of that as a fortress. If you'll come a little closer, you'll notice that they have cut into the logs right here small openings where they could shoot out at their enemies without exposing themselves. You also could have platforms built where you could shoot out over the wall, but this is much better. You can be behind the wall, put your gun out, see your enemy without actually exposing yourself to enemy fire. One remarkable story here at Fort Saint-Jean-Baptiste: when the Natchez Indians decided to rise up along the frontier and go to war with both the Spanish and the French, they marched towards this fort. Remarkably, the Spanish at Los Ides and the French here at Fort Saint-Jean-Baptiste and the local Natchez Indians all banded together to fight the Natchez. And for a number of days, the Natchez attacked the fort. Ultimately, the French and their allies were successful, and they were able to hold off and defeat the Natchez. Along the frontier, you often had cooperation between the local Spanish and French, although they were forbidden by law to cooperate or trade with each other. Being this far on the frontier, they were interacting, they were trading with each other, and even often marrying, because the French, quite frankly, didn't have a lot of women up here, but over at Los Ides there were a few more Spanish women that might be available for marriage, and so there were actually family bonds between these two settlements as well. They were only 15 miles apart.
However, by 1862, the situation in Louisiana had changed. The 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, resulted in the defeat of France. France was forced to cede its territories west of the Mississippi River to Spain. So when Spain took over the territory, there was no longer a need for a fortress at Natchez, because this was no longer the border between Spanish and French territory. Instead, it was all Spanish. So the Spanish abandoned the fort. Nevertheless, Fort Jean-Baptiste had served its purposes and helped to establish an important outpost in what is now central Louisiana, a vital link on the road into Spanish Texas. And hopefully this has given you a little bit of insight in what the fort was like, and a little insight into Louisiana's part in Texas history.